Narcissism, like so many characterological traits, is a spectrum. On the one end, there's a kind of healthy narcissism, being able to be proud of yourself, to own and claim what you have done, to feel deserving of your, of a good reflection from your accomplishments. And then far on the other end, we have malignant narcissism that verges on sociopathy, sadism, and really sometimes complete lack of empathy. So let's talk about what comes in the middle between these.
That was Dr. Joan Borisenko, and she just highlighted two poles of narcissism that are often easy to pick up on. The thing is, narcissism can present, as we all know, in a number of ways, and some of them aren't so apparent. So in this module, we'll get into several of the obvious as well as the more subtle ways that narcissism can present. First, we'll quickly look at a few of the more covert forms of narcissism. Then you'll hear some key indicators that your client has narcissistic traits, and we'll also highlight two subtle indicators, including one that may sound counterintuitive. And to close out this module, we'll dive into a case study to see how one expert worked with a client whose narcissism wasn't immediately recognizable. So let's dive in. To start, let's look at some of the flavors of narcissism you might encounter.
As clinicians, it's easy to miss more subtle narcissism, also called vulnerable narcissism, which can occur in people who are both empathetic and well-meaning, but just so concerned with how other people perceive them that they become almost obsessively self-centered and anxious, constantly monitoring people's responses to them. If you look at the continuum, you've got sexual narcissists. You certainly have somatic narcissists who worship the perfect body. You think about the whole growth industry around the Kardashians and the sale of products that are going to make you just perfect, and having to be perfect or feeling that you're somehow inferior. And there are people really whose sense of identity is very tied up with the worship of the body as perfect. Then you get intellectual narcissists who, the kind of know-it-all one-uppers who get their supplies, who get their needs met by being more clever and smarter than others. And then I'm particularly interested in spiritual narcissists since I happen to do spiritual direction. And some of the TV evangelists and preachers who use spirituality as a way to manipulate people, make money, and exert dominance.
So now that you've got a sense of the various shades of narcissism, let's look at a few different ways narcissism can present.
One of the diagnostic feely things about narcissism is the person takes up the room, right? They take up all the space in the room, and they're not even aware that they're doing it. And they're talking about themselves, and they're not even aware that they're doing it, right? And whatever anybody else says, it comes back to them, and they're not even aware that they're doing it. And they put down others and dismiss others, and they're not even seeing that that's happening, right? So if they're called on it, they might say, whatever, you're too sensitive. I'm just saying blah, 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 blah.
So one common indicator that your client may have narcissistic tendencies is that they'll continually pull focus onto themselves. And often they don't even realize they're doing it. Let's go on now and look at a few more indicators.
I'm thinking of patients who are often competitive, who are often challenging, who are often demanding, and who have a very poor theory of mind in being able to understand relationships with other people through the impact of their behavior on others. So for example, a patient who comes in and in session says something, which has happened to me, you're earning $200 an hour. I'm an IT lawyer. I'm earning $600 an hour. I feel comfortable seeing you because of that. And another patient who said, when I saw them for the initial consultation, asked me how old I was, and the implication was I wasn't old enough to really understand or have the experience to help them. Other patients who show up saying, "Oh, I've read an article of yours, I've seen you interviewed here and there," and starting out the first time I've met them with that presentation, and therefore building me up in a way that I can't possibly meet their expectations.
As Dr. Zindel Siegel just noted, narcissism might also be couched in competitive, challenging, or demanding behavior. And again, you'll often see this happening outside the client's level of awareness. Not only that, but many clients with narcissistic tendencies are also unaware of how their behaviors impact the people around them. And when it's brought up, they'll often deflect responsibility.
Sometimes what you come up against is this puzzlement. And sometimes that puzzlement is reflected in the fact that if the person's in trouble, it's other people's fault. Blaming other people. A list of grievances of what other people have done to them. A quick ability to write other people off. And then with all of these patterns in place, so it's other people, no personal responsibility, very little sense of impact on others, very low theory of mind. And then the encounter with the therapist is very much, what can you do for me? How can you fix me?
Now, Zindel just briefly touched on how a client's narcissism can impact the therapeutic relationship. We'll dive deeper into how you might work with that in Module 9. But for now, let's look at a few more important indicators of narcissism.
One of them was that they're building us up. Another one might be that they're talking at us and telling stories endlessly. A third one is if our own competitive juices are getting activated, there's a chance that this other person is somehow stuck on this level of social comparison a lot, that it can be very subtle, but people simply talk or act or posture in a way that we start to feel activated, where we're starting to do the same, or we're starting to feel inadequate in some way. So I think it can be very useful to be attuned to whenever that's coming up in us, because it's likely that it's getting triggered in part because this other person is really stuck on this dimension and is struggling there.
So according to Dr. Ron Siegel, your own internal cues can help you track whether your client is displaying narcissistic tendencies. Now, so far we've looked at what you might think of as some of the more obvious signs of narcissism. So let's pivot now and get into the more subtle ways that narcissism can present. For example, it might show up in a client's posture or movements.
Needing to have power over others often does show up in a mobilizing energy mobilized upward, or just in a hardening of the chest area especially. I always feel like underneath this is some anger and sometimes even rage about how they've been treated in the past that made them form that particular way of being in the world. So there can be anger in the arms, and the jaw, and the voice can all show that. But control and power can show up in different ways with different people. Some people are much more seductive in their bodies, and more slippery, not just mobilized upwards. So we don't want to stereotype it. We want to find out how each client embodies this grandiosity for narcissism. One client, it was just this lift of the chin, like this. Her chin was always up like this. The rest of her body looked pretty integrated, but her chin, it was always like she was always looking down on others. Is what it felt like, and so of course with her, we had to work with that, and the fear she had of just lowering her chin. So simple. But it brought up so many issues.
Okay, now there's one more subtle sign of narcissism that can be important to keep in mind, and it might even sound a bit counterintuitive, but here's how it played out with one of Dr. Pat Ogden's clients.
I'm remembering a client, for example, who really had traits of narcissism and grandiosity, who wanted to pay me twice as much as what I charged. And this, one of the ways that people in this strategy often feel safer is when they kind of have power over somebody else. And one of the ways of kind of getting that power was to pay me more. And I didn't accept it, but we had to work with that. And he was really disappointed that I didn't accept it. So looking for little ways like that of the ways of having control or having power are not always harmful. They're often with generosity or giving, taking care of somebody. In fact, often people who have the strategy, they might have somebody in a relationship with them that they kind of have to take care of because that makes them feel safe. They don't get taken care of. They don't want to be taken care of because it makes them feel vulnerable.
Narcissistic or grandiose behaviors are often thought of as harmful or toxic. But just like with Pat's client, narcissism can sometimes hide in helpful or generous behaviors as well. So to help bring home how you might identify and work with these more subtle, covert forms of narcissism, let's get into a case study. I want you to hear how Dr. Joan Borisenko worked with one woman who didn't present with what we'd usually classify as typical narcissistic or grandiose behaviors.
This is the kind of person who, rather than craving the spotlight and needing constant admiration, the tendency is this is a person who's more shy, self-effacing, deeply hypersensitive to other people's perceptions of them. And the kind of covert narcissism can come along with being like secretly envious of others who do something that you think you should be able to do. And this was a woman of about 60, and I'll call her Janine. And we met in spiritual direction, which is once a month, for about a year or so. And she was very soft-spoken and kindly. And she came to the mentoring relationship because she had this enormous idealistic desire to change the world, and she couldn't feel good about herself unless she could change the world. She was full of grandiose ideas about how she could make the world a better place. And she'd been a nun for several years in her late teens and 20s, and then she left the order. She got married, and she worked as a high school teacher for most of her life. And she felt like people really didn't understand religion. This is why she came to me. So she wrote a book about that, about how if we could just all get back to the Christ self within us and practice, the techniques that brought us there, the world could be saved. Well, she self-published the book. It didn't sell a whole lot of copies. And this was deeply upsetting to her. And, it wasn't about anything material. It wasn't about money. She didn't expect to be a best-selling author and get on Oprah. But in conversation, like the people she aspired to be, the people she admired were like Mother Teresa. And actually Helen Schuchman, who wrote a book entitled A Course in Miracles. She admired Marianne Williamson, who kind of popularized A Course in Miracles. And she would come and say, they made a difference in the world. And then she would try to come up with another scheme of some sort to like bring the good news to people. And, while we all need role models to admire, this was a kind of envy of people who make a giant difference. And it was grandiose thinking. And she did truly believe in a world that could be a beautiful, beautiful world. I admire her vision of what could possibly be possible. The trouble was, as one person, it's hard to bring that all about. So little by little, we took a look at how that worldview of trying to save the world actually revolved around thinking that was all about I, me, and mine. I have to do this, my book, my big ideas. I have to be the savior. Yes, she might have wanted to help others realize some kind of divine union or, whatever you want to call it, their core self, their consciousness of the whole. But her inner dialogue and narrative were all about herself. So we're discussing this. And she had this aha one day. She said, the letter I, is smack in the center of the word pride. And pride, or vanity, as it's often called in religious literature, is truly an excessive belief in your own abilities that actually shrouds a person's recognition of divine grace. It's like hubris. You're not the center of the universe. You're not the great divine director. You're an instrument. Something else, some greater inspiration needs to come through you. What we did was recognize that pride could be reframed, not as a sin, but as a gateway to true humility, which is thought to be the very greatest of the virtues. So this was a big turning point for her in her understanding. But, she still had a mental habit of being really hard on herself. And that's what we were working on, that recognition that humility was also about being much more spacious with herself, recognizing the grandiose thinking and naming it when it came up as a form of rumination. We actually did a little of Dan Siegel kind of work. Name it to tame it. There it is. There's pride. Reframing it. Pride is a doorway to humility. And then trying to breathe, let go, let that huge need to save the world be there, but then watch it, mindfully and see it dissipate a bit.
So notice Joan's approach of mixing awareness building with perspective taking and how that led to the breakthrough that helped her client begin to shift her narcissistic inner narrative. Now in the next module, we'll dive into what you might think of as the two key components of narcissism and how you can work with them. I'll see you in Module 2.